אני עדיין בהתאוששות. Hi Geshe. Hi everybody. Good to see you. I hope that you're all well. And I would like to make an announcement. Starting on the 17th of October, in 2 weeks' time, our session, our teaching will start 1 hour earlier. Next week, it will be at the same time as today, but starting on the 17th, we'll start 1 hour earlier. Okay? I'll repeat it next week to remind everybody. Next week will be the same time. And as usual, if you like to make a donation, express your generosity and appreciation for our teacher, please don't be shy to use the donation button. As the lead will write it soon, will show it soon in the chat. And questions will always be welcome as usual. Thank you. Thank you, Geshe.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so let's start right away. Great. Now, of course, as usual, we start with some breathing meditation. So take a deep breath. Try to let go of any disruptive thoughts and just watch your breath. And then visualize in the space in front of you the embodiment of all perfected qualities. Embodiment of great compassion, of wisdom, all appearing in the form of the Buddha. Who's teaching us to reach the same state, the same enlightened state. He's wearing the saffron robes of a fully ordained monk. Seated on an open lotus. On top of that, a sun disk and a moon disk. Passionately gazing at us. And he's surrounded by those who've attained high realizations through practicing what the Buddha has taught. And have passed on the teachings of the Buddha in an unbroken lineage. Like Nagarjuna, Ayadeva, Chandakirti, and all the other great Indian masters. I think that likewise the great masters of Tibet, Shantarakshita, the great Milarepa, Sakya Pandita, Lama Tsongkhapa, all the great masters, all the Dalai Lamas. And those of other traditions from other countries where the Buddha's teachings have flourished. Just feel their presence right in front of you. Inspiring us and helping us at the same time to accumulate great merit and dependence on them. And then also think that you're surrounded from all sides by all sentient beings. Completely surrounding you in the merit field in front of you. All of them wishing to be happy and satisfied and not to suffer, just like ourselves. And all of them at some point in the past being very close to us in a previous life, except that they don't remember, we don't remember. And it's a dependence on them that we can practice love, compassion, generosity, patience. And the nature of their mind, their actual nature, the actual nature of their consciousness does not differ from that of a Buddha. Whatever is afflicting them right now is merely adventitious, not in the nature of their mind. Remembering all that, let's start with generating affectionate love towards each of those sentient beings. Feeling of closeness and acceptance of all their shortcomings. All of them deserving to be loved and to be held precious. But then becoming aware that they experience endless problems and difficulties, generate great compassion. The wish, may all of these sentient beings, may they all be free from all their unpleasant experiences and the causes of those. May I be able to protect them. From whatever is in the way to the liberated state of mind. And your great compassion then grows stronger and turns into the determination. I will do whatever I can to lead sentient beings towards a state free from all obstructions. Obstructions to liberation. and even enlightenment. Since we can do that most effectively only once we become enlightened ourselves, let's generate the mind of enlightenment. The sincere aspiration or even determination to become fully enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. And it's with that motivation that we will continue to study Chandakirti's entering into the middle way. And without letting go of this motivation, let's recite the prayers. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then directed at the merit field. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginning this time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. Okay, all right. Okay, so I've been thinking anyway, so we've already spent 16 minutes, 17 almost. Maybe I should shorten the beginning a little bit. I leave it up to you. So you could maybe decide and let Leora know whether we should shorten it a little bit. Maybe I can go through it a little faster. Because, well, I'd like to give you, I need to give you some explanation anyway that I'd like to do today, and it takes some time. I've also received some question. Where's the message now? Delete sent me something. Jimmy asked a few questions, and I will just do the first one. Unfortunately, I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Okay. So, yeah, it doesn't show. I don't know why. Oh, yeah, here it is. Just to, there's a sentence before that, but I don't need to read that. So his question is, what is the difference between the conventional I and the mere I? All right. What's the difference between the two? Well, there is no difference. Conventional I means, well, conventional as in conventionally existent, as in merely labeled. You could also say conventional as a conventional truth, but really conventionally existent in the sense of, like I said, existent. And of course, I, as in like, of course, the I exists. No one is saying there is no I. There's just not a certain I, the way it appears to us ordinarily. That doesn't exist. But other than that, there is an I, of course. And then the mere I is the I that is merely labeled. Again, mere as in like, not just labeled, but merely as in like, it has no other inherent existence other than that. So they mean the same thing. Oh, and I just realized, of course, I didn't tell you what to do for this coming week. I still need to do that. Sorry, I just mixed up the order. Of course, for this coming week, to continue to study or no, to continue to train ourselves, familiarize ourselves with the Dharma, bodhicitta, of course, generate the mind of enlightenment the way we just did in this meditation, or if you have another way you feel more comfortable with, you can adopt that, or you can use that again first thing in the morning, and then throughout the day, however fake it may feel, however difficult it may be at times to generate this mind, but just continue doing it, especially when things are difficult, when you've got a hard time. Always go back. Practicing for the welfare. This is for the welfare of all sentient beings. I want to become a Buddha for the welfare of each and every sentient being. And then, of course, as part of the meditation that we're going through over a few weeks, well, last time I started talking about self-cherishing, the disadvantages of self-cherishing. The disadvantages, briefly said, easily said, are that they lead to all our suffering. So the reason we suffer is because of self-cherishing. Of course, self-grasping is the root cause, but if self-cherishing didn't give rise to self-cherishing, to self-centeredness, we wouldn't suffer. So self-centeredness is another main cause of all our suffering, besides ignorance. And it's attachment to the I. I've mentioned it before, but just to recognize it within ourselves, of course, that's the first step. Every time you feel miserable, every time things go wrong, you'll definitely have self-cherishing in one way or another. Attachment to I, attachment to that which is mine. And to just recognize without starting to hate your own self-cherishing, without generating resentment. No, it's just understanding its disadvantages. Don't suppress it. Don't try to suppress it. Just become aware how it leads to all our problems, each one of them. So it creates the circumstances we find ourselves in the future. I mean, right now creates our future, the future situation, which is in the nature of suffering. And even when it arises, the moment attachment arises, the stronger, it's a type of attachment to the self, and the stronger the attachment, the greater the fear. It usually goes along with fear. Fear of not not being able to get what we want. Now, with regard to this type of attachment towards the I, like self-centeredness being attached to I and mine, of course, what we associate with the I, what is important to the I, what do I need? Well, happiness, first of all, but also other things that are associated with happiness, success, possessions, certain friends, family, loved ones, and so forth. So just becoming aware that this mind, this attached, this exaggeration of ourself, and I haven't mentioned this a lot before, but the fact that before we have attachment, before we have any other afflictive emotion, any of these emotional states like anger and so forth, there's always a mind that exaggerates the object it is attached to, or the object it is angry with, or jealous of, and so forth. Now, in this case of the self-centeredness, the importance of the I is exaggerated. That precedes the actual attachment. So you have self-grasping, the mind of ignorance, that gives rise to exaggerating the I, exaggerating its importance, its value. And then after the exaggeration has taken place, so the exaggeration itself is not attachment yet, but then there's attachment. There's this emotional state, which we call self-centeredness. All right. So just to recognize again and again that it leads to exaggerated actions, it leads us to harm others, but even positive actions, positive samsaric actions that lead to samsaric happiness, well, even that is in the nature of suffering, because it cannot give us any lasting happiness. And the degree of happiness is, well, it's the degree of happiness that we experience in samsara as compared to nirvanic happiness, where happiness of freedom from suffering cannot be compared. All right. So please continue with just watching the self-centered mind, and be aware. Remind yourself every time it arises, it gives rise to more samsaric, well, suffering, or at least samsaric experiences. And it is that which keeps us from actualizing our fullest potential. All right, so for this coming week, and I already answered the question. All right, now what I'd like to talk about today, I have mentioned it briefly, and it's still part of these verses 130, 147, 148, 149. I'd like to say a little bit more about the difference between substantially existent and imputedly existent. Now, Chandrakirti mentions it so often. It is mentioned again and again in the texts. However, it's not really explained, not to the same degree as inherent existence, true existence, or ultimate truth, conventional truth. We had a lot of explanations on this. And one of the difficulties here is as well, on top of not understanding what imputedly means, what substantially means, is that Chandrakirti addresses some of the lower tenet systems, the lower tenet schools, and is refuting them based on this terminology. So I thought just give you just a brief explanation of this, because teaching in the West, I don't think it's explained that much. Substantially existent. I mean, what does that mean even? Substance. Are we talking about a substance? No. It's not saying there's necessarily a substance if something exists substantially. And you may not feel it's helpful to hear about the other schools like Vaibhashika, Satantrika, and so forth with regard to what substantially existent means. However, from the little that I studied, well, I feel that it is still quite helpful. Even just a brief kind of sense of what it means may be helpful in this context. It's similar to learning about the true truth, and learning about the true truth, not just from the point of view of the Prasangika, but also from the point of view of the lower schools. And so together with that, it may be helpful to understand that the Buddha's goal was, of course, to lead students, lead disciples, lead all sentient beings, basically towards the view of the Prasangika. And when he taught in India, teaching anyone who the Buddha met, who were open to these ideas, through his omniscience, his all-knowingness, knowing exactly what was appropriate. So often he used the same words that he would use to explain the Prasangika tenet, or the Prasangika tenet system, the Prasangika view. He used the same vocabulary, but he explained it slightly differently. And it was helpful just from a psychological point of view, just using those words already. But if he had used the words in the same way as he used them to explain them to someone who was ready to receive the Prasangika view, well, they would have fallen into the extreme of nihilism. So he used the same words, but explained them slightly differently. And it makes total sense. Now, when we hear this, and there's a debate between different schools using the same terminology, we may feel, well, what's the point in doing that? How the Vaibhashika explains it is different to the Prasangika, so why discuss it in the first place? But of course, there is a similarity there, and it just takes a student, a follower of these views closer to the highest view. And we are in a certain way. So 147, 48, and 149, those three verses, I started them last time. I want to also show how they're relevant to us on a personal level, how we can translate these verses such that we can see these are also helpful in our everyday life. All right. And that seems impossible, possibly right now. But first, I want to say something about, well, substantially existent, as opposed to imputedly. In the Prasangika school, pretty simple. Imputedly means labeled, imputed. And since we know everything is imputed, well, then it's obvious nothing can be substantially existent. And if nothing is substantially existent, and since it's taught in the context of emptiness, well, substantially existent, inherently existent mean the same thing. So it's quite straightforward, no problem there. However, in the lower systems, slightly different. It's explained slightly differently. Now, let's start with the Vaibhashika. So far, the explanation I've given was very general, but maybe it's helpful since in the verses just mentioned, Chandrakirti addresses followers of the Vaibhashika, but a certain subgroup called the Samityas. And even to be more precise, they're actually called the Vatsiputra, a Vaibhashika group called Vatsiputra. Never mind, it's just a word for you right now. But what does the Vaibhashika say in general? Forget about the sub-school, but just in general, the Vaibhashika school says that everything exists, is established as substantially. Everything substantially established and substantial and existent are the same thing. So they use another term, substantially established, and they say everything that exists is substantially established, and therefore every phenomenon, well, whatever is there, whatever exists, has that quality of being substantially established. So it means just the same as existent. But they say there's also something as, so they distinguish between substantially established and substantially existent. No other school draws that distinction. Okay. But what do they say is the meaning of substantially existent? It actually means an ultimate truth, according to them, that is substantially existent, and a conventional truth, according to them, is imputedly existent. That's how it's usually explained in the different tenet schools. What is an ultimate truth? Well, an ultimate truth is, let's start with a conventional truth. It's a phenomenon that when it is broken up or mentally separated into individual parts, it stops being that phenomenon. Okay? That's not ultimate truth conventional truth the way we know it, but it kind of puts us in that direction, dividing things up and not finding something there. So if you take a vase or if you take a table, if you divide it up, you break it up or mentally separate it into individual parts, it stops being a table, right? If you mentally break it up, if you just visualize, you break it up, it's no longer a table. And then a conventional truth is something, well, if you break it up, mentally separate it into parts, it remains the same thing. So that's, according to them, an ultimate truth. Okay. Now, if you study this in more detail, it becomes more and more obvious that this, not obvious, but it makes more and more sense. But maybe it gives you a degree, like a certain sense, okay, that's what it means. Substantially existent or ultimate truth is if you separate it, it's still the same thing. So if you say physical object, that's an ultimate truth, because a physical object, if you divide it up, it's still a physical object. Right? So just in general, physical object. Of course, the table is also a physical object, but just using this idea of course, physical objects exist. So if you separate a physical object, you still have a physical object. So it seems a bit like cheating, because it's, when you separate it, it's not exactly the same physical object, but it's really just a way of saying there's some things that are more real than others. And so what do they say? That which you separate and it loses its original entity, well, that exists imputedly. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. So it's imputed, therefore. If you take a vase, well, a vase is imputed, you label it on the basis of something other than itself. And they're not saying it doesn't exist inherently. They say it exists inherently. Of course it exists inherently. Everything exists inherently, can be found. There's something from the side of the object. But they don't go as far, of course, as the Prasangika, but they say, well, but if you take it apart, it's no longer a vase. So therefore, it's just called a vase. Or not just, but it's called a vase. It's called a vase. It exists inherently, but it's also imputed. Whereas just a form, for instance, if you divide it up, or just consciousness itself, just consciousness, if you divide it up, it's still consciousness. If you separate it into sub-moments, it's still consciousness. So consciousness is an ultimate truth. It exists substantially. That is the Vaibhashika school. And then the other schools, well, let's say Sautantrika following reasoning, then Chittamatra, and Madhyamika Svatantrika. So all the other schools except the Prasangika school, they say, well, I've said it before, substantially existent means that in order to perceive it, in order for the object to appear, nothing else has to appear. The thing itself appears, but nothing other than the thing appears at the same time. So they would say, again, consciousness exists substantially. They don't call it an ultimate truth. That's different to the Vaibhashika school. But they say it exists substantially because nothing else but consciousness appears when you take to mind consciousness. So it doesn't depend on anything other than itself for it to appear to the mind. While a vase, again, similar to the Vaibhashika, they also say a vase or a table is imputed in that when the vase appears, something other than the vase has to appear for the vase to appear. The front of the vase, the base of the vase, the belly of the vase, and so forth. Or a table, something other than the table itself has to appear. So you depend on other things for it to appear, so it's imputed. Again, it makes sense. Having said all that, all right, I don't think it's that difficult. And still, the difficulty that comes in here is they also say that in terms of the person. So this is where it becomes a little difficult. Now, all of them in general say there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Now, what they mean is what they refer to. So all of them assert that there's a person that is imputedly existent. That is the person we can see. Okay, there's a person. So this view is, I guess it's in the Svatantrika, it's kind of explained in the best way. I mean, in the like Baba Viveka's lamp of wisdom, for instance, there he talks about, Baba Viveka talks about that. So the person existing being imputedly existent, in that based on the 5 aggregates, well, actually all of them assert this definition of a person. A person is someone who's is labeled or imputed or designated on the basis of any of the 5 aggregates. They all assert that to be the definition of person. So it means they do assert an imputed person. But they say at the same time, since the person exists inherently, it means that different to the Prasangika school, you'll find something that is the actual person. There's something there that's the actual person. And here they differ. Some say you find the 5 aggregates, that's the actual person. Or some would say you find the mental consciousness, as the Svatantrika would say, you find the mental consciousness, that's the real person. This exists, that what you find, that kind of actual person, they all agree that exists substantially. There must be something substantial there, because whenever you label something, when you impute something, that which you label it on, there must be something substantially there. You can't have something being imputed on the basis of something that's also just imputed. That would mean there's nothing there. That's the view of the lower schools. It's only the Prasangika school that says not only is the person, for example, imputed, but also the basis. The base is also imputed, and the basis of that is also imputed. It is always just imputed. There's nothing essential there. There's nothing inherent there. So this is only the Prasangika who says that. The other schools say, all of them say, you always find something. That's why they posit, and they always posit the aggregates, something, one of the aggregates, all of the aggregates, or the continuum of the aggregates. I mean, they have to posit that, because otherwise they become like the non-Buddhists who say the self exists separate from the aggregates. There's no other choice. If you want to find something there, if you say the person exists inherently, that means, in other words, when you search for the person, one or different, or then you'll find something. There must be something there. And if you assert that, then what else are you going to say? It has to be the aggregates. In that way, they end up having these two kind of self. A substantially existent self, like the aggregates, one of the aggregates that serve as a basis of imputation, and the imputed person. And that imputed person, that does not exist as a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. And here, substantially in the sense of self-sufficient, that, for instance, the person is like totally like a different entity than the aggregates, in the sense of like one being like a king and the other one being the subject of the king. So the aggregates being like a servant, and the imputed I being like a king, like a kind of sort of separate added entity that controls the aggregates. All right. So that is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, which they do assert, but it refers to that imputed person. It's a little bit complicated, but it's like anything. You hear it enough and you think about it and you read about it, and at some point it starts to make sense. I hope it's clear enough. Now, why am I saying all that? Because here in these verses, 147, 48, and 149, actually Chandrakirti addresses a school that is quite different to all these, holds very different assertions, different to the ones that I just described. It's a sub-school of the Vaibhashika called Samidya, and actually Samidyas, they have 5 other sub-schools. So the Samidya, you may have heard that the Vaibhashika has 18 sub-schools altogether, 18 different types of Vaibhashikas. And we don't know so much about all of them. There's more like a general explanation that's given. But here, one of the sub-schools is called Samidya, and that has 5 subdivisions. So Vatsiputra is one of them, Bhadrayaniyas, Kurukulas, and so forth. So even if you don't have all the names, it's just names. So the Vatsiputra, those are interesting because they are quite different. They're quite different. And be aware, Chandrakirti uses of all of them, uses them. uses them just because they have a very different view. Can't be that, just that. There must be something, and that's what everything Chandrakirti says, that's for us relevant. Why would he say it? It's not just for the sake of refuting someone. No, he teaches, of course, those who are ready for the Prasangika, and hopefully we're a part of that. And so we shouldn't just go through it and just ignore it, but possibly see how we can apply this to ourselves. Now, what is their view? I mentioned it before. They have a quite unusual, quite different kind of view, different from everything I said before. They don't assert that this imputed person or the I, they don't explain it in that same way. They rather talk about the person as being inexpressible, and you heard this before, as being one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates, or permanent, impermanent, being inexpressible. All right, we've heard this before, so that's not that difficult. However, I lost what I was going to say. That was the passage. Oh yeah, here it is. However, now the question that arises, okay, it's inexpressible as being one with the aggregates or different, as being permanent or impermanent. Well, okay. But the question that arises, are they saying that this person, this inexpressible person, does this person exist as substantially or as imputedly? Is it one of the two? And the Vatsiputra is not typical Vaibhashika. So let's not expect them to answer in a typical Vaibhashika way. They have certain views that are very similar, other views regarding other concepts that are similar to the Vaibhashika, but regarding this matter, they're quite different. The person being inexpressible. Okay, now I just quickly want to draw the line to ourselves. In what way is this relevant to us? Well, if we analyze the I, we may also reach a point when we go, well, it feels so strongly that there is an I, and I don't want to be without this I. My whole life has been around this I. Are you kidding me? Everything I've been doing so far has been for nothing. That's definitely one reason why we would have fear. I mean, usually it's said that's a good type of fear when we hear about selflessness, like, oh no, that can't be true. There's a type of fear, it's good, but we need to overcome this fear at some point. But the point is that when we hear this for the first time, there may be a sense, or not just for the first time, but when we get introduced to this, well, maybe the I is inexpressible. It kind of seems not to be this and not to be that. It doesn't seem to be one with the aggregates. No, that doesn't make sense. Separate doesn't make sense. Permanent doesn't make sense. Impermanent doesn't make sense. But it's there. I feel it so strongly. Oh, inexpressible. Yeah. And it's interesting. Sometimes when, I translate for someone or I myself give a class, sometimes the audience asks this question. I remember it in particular, I think Jandaram, she once gave a teaching at Tushita, and there was someone also asking, well, who knows, maybe the person is just this mystical thing. We can't say it's this or it's that. It's almost like people say, well, it's so difficult to believe in God, like, I'm not familiar with other Abrahamic faith, but for instance, in the Catholic Church, I'm a little bit more familiar with that because I was raised Catholic. Oh, just have faith. You'll have doubt, but you have to overcome this faith. And don't ask too many questions. God is mysterious. Very interesting, this idea of just God is mysterious. So just take it on. It's just indescribable. It's mysterious. So the sense there must be something. There must be God. But let's let God be a little bit mysterious. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of that. So the self, there must be a self, because it's like, come on, I feel it in every moment and governs all my action. The self is always there. It must be there because it appears to my mind. You can't tell me it's not there. And other people feel the same way. So it must be there. But when I start investigating, I can't find it. So something mysterious. Something mysterious. It's just maybe something very, so that for me, that to me expresses exactly this inexpressibility. It's something that's mysterious. We just can't grasp it. This is, I think, where it becomes relevant for us. And the thing is, you may not feel that way, But the thing is, what are you saying? You don't feel that way. None of your minds, none of your consciousnesses feel that way. And of course, when we say I feel that, that is determined by the different types of mind that feel that. But a lot of minds we're not even aware of. I mean, let's face it, a lot of consciousnesses, I mean, when you're on autopilot, there's a consciousness that is responsible for directing you home when you drive in a car, and later on you have no idea how you got home. You were preoccupied thinking of something else and still you got home. So there was a mind that was responsible for you to find your way home. If you had been unconscious, you wouldn't have made your way home. So you had to be conscious for that. So there was a mind that was active and you didn't know it was there. It was doing its thing. And it happens to me all the time that I do certain things and later I go like, oh, I just did this. Oh, how bizarre. Like I have no recollection of it actually happening, and still it happened. So there's so many minds sometimes working together. And the same is true for our self-cherishing, for our self-grasping. There are minds, I'm pretty sure, I mean, it's hard to say, I'm pretty sure they're there when I don't know they're there, but it's like, we are so used to self-grasping. We're so used to it. We should not underestimate self-grasping. We call it self-grasping as if it was this one thing, but it consists of so many different ways in which the mind somehow keeps holding on to something there. So this is a mind that is very, very strong and very powerful. And when we try to grab it at this point, it leads us somewhere else. So we'll always find a way around. This is why this text is so thorough. It tries to kind of take any kind of possibility in which our mind tries to slip away and address that. And of course, if we go through it in meditation, it becomes so much more effective. Having said this, all right, let's go back now to the Vatsiputra, who have this bizarre view that the self is inexpressible. Okay. Now, the question that arises, as I mentioned early on, how do they look at this inexpressible self? Does it exist substantially or does it exist imputedly? Because all the other schools pretty much say it's one or the other. Prasangika says only imputedly. The Vaibhashika says, well, all the other schools, I mean, also including really the Vaibhashika, there's a substantial and there's a imputed one. But the Vatsiputra says, well, there are two views. The two views. Some say that according to the Vatsiputra, it's neither. It's neither substantially existent nor imputedly existent. And that's based on something Vasubandhu said. Vasubandhu, as you probably know, taught a text or composed a text called the Abhidharmakosha. And in there, actually, he mainly sets forth the Satantrika school, but by way of refuting the Vaibhashika, in that saying, well, the Vaibhashika says this, but really the Satantrika, that's the right school. So he sets forth the Vaibhashika school by way of actually refuting it, but he explains it very extensively. So this is the source we use to understand what the Vaibhashika school is really thinking, or what their views are, I should say. All right. And there's a self-commentary, there's a commentary he composed on the Abhidharmakosha, self-commentary. And in there he says, and here I'm just, quoting, here I will analyze how the Vatsiputra assert that the person exists. Do they assert it as substantially existent, or do they assert it as imputedly existent? That person, and now the answer comes, is not just substantially existent and is also not imputedly existent. Some take this to mean it's neither substantially, it's not just substantially existent, and it's also not imputedly existent. Some say, well, he's saying it's neither, not substantially and also not imputedly existent. Others say, no, he's not saying that. He's saying not just substantially existent. When you say not just substantially existent, you're saying it is substantially existent, but also something other than that. All right. Of course, that makes sense. It's substantially existent, it's impermanent, what have you. Okay. So The Vatsiputra school, therefore, the school that is usually asserted more, and that also Chandrakirti seems to follow, is that this self does exist substantially. It's inexpressible as being one with the aggregates, different from the aggregates. It's inexpressible as being permanent or impermanent. Oh yeah, they wouldn't say it's permanent or impermanent. It's neither of those. Sorry, I said before it was impermanent, but no, it's not. So it's inexpressible in that way. But it's substantially existent. It's not just substantially existent, because it also exists in general. It's a phenomenon. You could add that. So the word just, it's just saying it's not just, it's substantially existent, but also has other characteristics. All right. So not just substantially existent, and it is also not imputedly existent. He's not saying it's not just imputedly existent. So therefore, these words actually, and this is the view that is usually followed, that Chandrakirti also seems to set forth here, that the self, this inexpressible self, is substantially existent, yes, but not imputedly existent. Not imputedly, but substantially. All right. Having said this, now let's go to the verses. Having said that, how do these verses, 147, 148, and 149, and again, I'm still trying to connect it back to our own sense, of our own sense of, or of our own misapprehension. Can we show the verses 140? Thank you. All right, 147, 148, and 149. Okay, 147 first, already, but let's do it again. Just as you, and now Chandrakirti is addressing this Vatsiputra, the Samitya sub-school. It's just to describe the Samitya, but actually it's the Vatsiputra. Just as you do not take, and so now he's saying, okay, let me just first explain it. In verse 147, he's saying, you assert that this inexpressible self exists substantially, but although you say it exists substantially, so you say it's substantially existent, so it's not imputed, it's substantially existent, and you say that it's inexpressible nonetheless with regard to its parts, with regards to the aggregates, well, then you should say the same about anything else that is substantially existent. For instance, the mind. So they don't say just the mental consciousness is the I. They don't assert that. It's actually the 5 aggregates, all of the 5 aggregates. That's usually what the Sammitya school says is the self. So the mind itself, they say it's substantially existent. The mind itself is substantially existent. And you don't say that the mind that is substantially existent, just as you say this inexpressible I is substantially existent. Well, with the mind, you don't say it's inexpressible as one with its parts, the sub moments of the mind, first moment of mind. Is it one with it or different? You don't. You say it's different or it's not different. You're very clear on that. So you don't draw this distinction, inexpressible this way, inexpressible that way. So if it's substantially existent, you shouldn't do that. Okay. That's what 147 means. Now, 148, there's another view of the Vatsiputra that's clear from this verse, actually. It's implied in that. The Vatsiputra says that there are phenomena that are imputedly existent, like the vase. They would say that the vase actually is imputedly existent. Similar, we did not discuss last week verse. What is this? Just saw this message. We did not discuss last week verse. No, we didn't. We didn't do 148, and we did do 148, but we didn't do 149. So I'll do this today. But here in verse 148, what is shown is that this Vatsiputra school actually holds that a vase is imputedly existent. So this is similar to the other Vaibhashika schools. It's when you divide it up, if you divide it into its parts, the vase starts disappearing. So it's an ultimate truth, so therefore it's imputed. So maybe that's their reason. It's not clear why, but they definitely say the vase is imputed. It's imputedly existent. And so it's imputedly existent. It also exists inherently, of course, that's different to the Prasangika. The Prasangika would say, because it's imputed, it doesn't exist inherently. No, they don't say that. They say it's imputedly existent, but of course also inherently. But it's imputedly existent, and therefore they say that also the vas, something that is imputedly existent, is also inexpressible. Also inexpressible with regard as one with its part or separate from its part. So for something imputedly existent, they say that. Okay, that's their view. But at the same time, they say the self is also inexpressible. So Chandrakirti is arguing, well, then you should be saying the self is imputedly existent, because you say that for other imputedly existent phenomena, that they are inexpressible. So for other substantially existent phenomena, such as the mind, for instance, or very subtle particle, the subtlest particle, partless particles, which the Vaibhashika asserts, you say of those they're substantially existent, and you don't say that they are you don't say that they're indescribable with regard to their parts. So you shouldn't, in 147, he says, well, you shouldn't say that with regard to the inexpressible I, because it's substantially existent. But in the next verse, he argues, but then you say that imputedly existent phenomena, they are indescribable with regard to their parts. They cannot be described as being one with their parts or different from their parts. So why don't you say that the person exists imputedly, taking them further to the Prasangika school, kind of like away from this kind of substantial existent, but imputedly? That's already, because imputedly means, well, it's just not just, but it's labeled on the basis of its parts. I mean, even if you hold it to be inherently existent, but if you already consent to, okay, it's imputedly existent, you're moving closer towards the Prasangika. And then, having said all this, so you see how he's kind of saying, okay, can't be, so in verse 147, to substantially existent doesn't make sense, because otherwise we also have to say the same for other substantially existent phenomena, that they're inexpressible, and you don't hold that. So then how about it's in verse 148, how about it's imputedly existent, taking the person away, taking the Vatsiputriya away. And then in 49, he says, well, with regard to consciousness, you don't actually say that consciousness is different from itself, but you think it to be different from form and other aggregates, right? You don't say that with regard to consciousness. Wait, let me just go to my text here. Just a sec. So here I read what Lama Tsongkhapa says, it's easier. Just as you do not take consciousness to be different from itself, so just as you do not take consciousness to be different from itself, likewise you should assert that the person is definitely not different from itself, but one with itself. Similarly, just as you think consciousness to be different from form and other aggregates, likewise you have to admit that the person is definitely an entity distinct from the aggregates. So forget about all this inexpressible. He's saying these two aspects of identity, of being one with and different from something, can be seen in all things. And because the self lacks these reality attributes, according to you, of identity and difference, it does not exist as a substantial reality. So he's saying it doesn't make sense that you distinguish between like the substantial. 147, he's saying, doesn't make sense that you say it's inexpressible. Other things that are also substantially existent, according to you, they're not inexpressible. In 148, he's saying, well, since you say imputedly existent phenomena, that they are imputedly existent phenomena, that they are inexpressible, then you should rather say, if you still insist that the self is inexpressible, you have to at least say it's imputedly existent. And in 149 is saying, but actually it doesn't exist at all, because whatever exists is either one with must be one with itself and different from everything that is its parts. So according to you, this self that's inexpressible doesn't make sense, right? So basically, let it go, this inexpressible self. I hope that's a little bit clear, this kind of the way he sets this forth. It's really clever, but now really clever in the sense of, well, addressing the Vatsiputriya school, But now the question is, how do, I'm not Vajraputra. If anything, I'd call myself Prasangika, right? I mean, that's how we feel intellectually. But of course, as I said, to us, we may have our moments when we study this, when we read this, it makes sense. We may have a Prasangika moment. But most of the time, we're none of these we're just plain, what would you call it? Like, we live our ignorance. We just live our ignorance. In each moment, we live our ignorance. And we reinforce our ignorance. And even if we try to bring it into our daily life, our self-grasping will somehow, it's almost like, you know, like you're in a swimming pool. The water is your self-grasping, and you're trying to remove water in one place, and right away the water flies back into that spot, right? You just kind of try to, or you have quicksand, so you're trying to remove the sand with a shovel, you kind of throw it out or throw it away, and then right away the sand kind of closes in again, or like with water, right away the water goes back in. That's our self-cherishing, that's our self-grasping right now. Right away our old habit will come back. So what we need to do is really integrate this, bring this into our daily life again and again and again, because otherwise there is no force that goes against, our self-cherishing mind, our self-grasping mind, or our ignorance. There's nothing. Our ignorance is just doing its thing and growing stronger, and you do a little bit of meditation on it, and maybe it weakens a little bit, but right away it's reinforced again. So yesterday I taught a class, and at the very end we recited this prayer by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, this dedication prayer. It's so beautiful, and it's so Lama Zopa Rinpoche. It's so typical for his style of teaching, and it's so beautiful. I don't want to read the whole prayer, but really the prayer, what he's saying is like, I, who doesn't exist inherently, dedicate the merit that doesn't exist inherently, that I've accumulated, which doesn't exist inherently, towards that is just to become like Buddha Shakyamuni, who doesn't exist inherently, so that I myself will become a Buddha who doesn't exist inherently. So after each of these sentences, it was so beautiful, because it's like our mind would otherwise automatically, oh, there's a Buddha, there's sentient beings. To us, they actually, if we don't consider emptiness, always seem to exist in and of themselves. So actually, we should, if we want to make emptiness more part of our life, maybe we should start thinking in the morning, I, who doesn't exist inherently, will take a shower, which doesn't exist inherently, and have a cup of coffee, which doesn't exist inherently. I mean, it's bizarre, but if we can, just to bring it back to mind again and again, in the same way as I keep mentioning bodhicitta, and that I do for the same reason, to have that aspect as well. But since we don't spend that much time in class, I mention it more as being part of your everyday life. But of course, also what you learn here, hopefully bring this into your daily life. And I don't specifically mention it, but of course, you need method and wisdom both. So to do exactly that, bring this together again and again, remind yourself, I'll work for the benefit. So I wake up in the morning, you generate bodhicitta, but you remind yourself, your enlightenment doesn't exist inherently. All sentient beings don't exist inherently. The teachings you follow don't exist inherently. Not even emptiness exists inherently. To also make an effort to remind yourself of that. And this is what these 3 verses kind of mean to me. In a sense, okay, now I'm trying to translate it loosely into how it's relevant to us. So it's almost like, if you want to, it's almost like I gave you the analogy of like you were in this I don't know, in some kind of pool, and there's lots of sand in there, and you're trying to dig a hole where there's no sand. Well, ordinarily, if you dig a hole and you throw out the sand, the other sand will just fall in, which is, like I said, it's analogous of the self-centered attitude. Like you have this thought, oh, the self doesn't exist inherently, but if you don't further think about it, well, it'll just the ignorance will just move in and things will just appear and seem the same way, and it'll be reinforced as usual. But if then you take maybe like a pipe or something, you put it in the sand and then you remove it, well, it won't cave in. It won't cave in. The sand won't cave in, but you have this empty space. So this is how I think of it in my mind, that we have to make more of an effort, bring emptiness more in our daily life, so that the self-centeredness does not kind of govern all our thoughts, or that we have at least the habit to remember, okay, I've just been insulted. Oh, but it doesn't exist inherently. The person who's insulting me doesn't exist inherently. There's a problem, doesn't exist. It's just labeled. If you find, okay, saying it doesn't exist inherently doesn't really affect you, it's just labeled. It's just labeled a problem. It's just labeled an insult. It's just labeled an obnoxious person who's just insulted me, and so forth. So that would be a way of counteracting this constant sense phenomena exist inherently. Now, with these verses, reading these verses, I was reminded of this. So we have a sense, ordinarily, there is a self. There's definitely a self. Is it one with the aggregates? We might even do the meditation. No, not really. Is it different? No, not really, but still there. So it's almost like, for us, it's kind of, yeah, it's not this, it's not that. It's kind of like beyond that. I guess we have these moments of, I don't know, desperation or what have you, feeling, oh, but it's somehow there. It is there. Come on, it's there. So as if it was inexpressible. But then that wouldn't make sense. We don't say something is inexpressible with regard to other phenomena. I mean, come on, the things around us, we never have a sense it's inexpressible. And it's so solid. The eye seems so solid. In what way can it be inexpressible? If it really existed the way it appears to us, the more we looked at us, the more we looked at it, the clearer it should become. Are you kidding me? The more we look at it, the more inexpressible it seems. That doesn't make sense. And then with regard to moving towards its imputed, well, I mean, if we look at a table, actually, when someone tells us the table is labeled, usually people get it very quickly. It doesn't take long. And we've heard this before. That doesn't mean emptiness. It doesn't mean we understood emptiness. We just understand, well, the table is just called a table. It makes sense to most people. I tell this to my mom and she understands it. You know, I tell her we call it a table. It's got no table. And she's like, yeah, big deal. But it doesn't really tackle her sense of I. So now to bring this sense of like it's labeled, a very coarse understanding of that something is labeled, to now bring this sense of it's inexpressible, but it's labeled. Okay. All right. So if it's labeled, well, then, okay, if it's labeled, then it's of course a little difficult to say one with its part different from its part. It's labeled. So one different. Okay. That makes a little bit more sense. So the I is labeled. And then, well, but still, if it exists inherently, it's either exactly one or totally separate. There's no other way. So the self that we perceive is impossible. You see how this from first just saying if it exists the way, so 147 is basically saying as solid as it appears to us and expressible. Are you kidding me? It should appear clearer and clearer. And if anything, if at all anything, so 148, if at all, something like a table, it's okay, that's labeled, and therefore it's one with its part, it's different from its parts. You know, it's kind of a little difficult, like totally separate from its part doesn't make sense. One with its part doesn't make sense. All right, so if you still go for inexpressible, at least go for a labeled, okay? But then if it's labeled and still it's like this solid thing, well, anything that exists is either one with itself and separate from its part. So let it go. It's let it go, this kind of self. It doesn't make sense. So in the end, with 149, you totally let go. All right. So sorry, this was the whole class. We just did one verse. But I felt, yeah, these verses, we went through them quickly and kind of understood what they meant. But the point is, Chandrakirti, with every verse, he's actually teaching us in that he's saying, even if I explicitly address the Vatsiputra, this is relevant to you, because there's no Vatsiputra reading this. I mean, who's reading this text? Vatsiputra, they don't read this, well, maybe a few or some at the time, but now this text is still relevant nowadays. It's actually addressed towards those who have definitely an inclination, they're inclined towards prasangika. So hopefully this will be a text based on which we realize emptiness. I mean, we definitely have a karmic connection to this text. His Holiness speaks about it all the time. We're studying it. We have a connection to His Holiness. So no doubt. Therefore, this is for us relevant. We need to understand this with every verse. And here in particular, it seems so, Vatsiputra, are you kidding me? It's got nothing to do with me. So we race through it because I want to get to something that's relevant to me. So hopefully we can see that this actually is relevant to us. All right. Okay. This is what I want to say today, and we'll do some short meditation on that. But yesterday also, when I taught this class, someone asked a question. There were some very good questions, but one question that maybe someone asked this before, but I don't remember really. And those who listened yesterday are not allowed to answer it, but the rest, this is your homework. You have already the answer, but I want to check whether you've understood this, or you can actually answer this. So you can send in your questions, send them to send your answers. If you feel confident enough, except those who were there present yesterday, I think it's at least 2 people. So for those who were not there yesterday and don't know what I said yesterday, please send in your answers to Dalit if you feel up to it. The question was, usually we talk about emptiness and dependent arising as 2 sides of the same coin, right? So sometimes it's even said that they're equivalent. Of course, they're not equivalent literally, but we talk about emptiness, we talk about dependent arising, and really just looking at the same thing from a different perspective. And the question was, why is emptiness the ultimate truth, but the dependent arising is not? Why is emptiness the ultimate truth, but interdependence, so not being independently existent. So if you want a negation here, not being independently existent or interdependently existent, why is that not the ultimate truth? Why is dependent arising, in other words, not the ultimate truth, but emptiness is? So I'll be curious to know your answer. Okay, great. So that's your homework, besides quite a few other homeworks. Yes, and then of course we'll continue next time. And please, maybe we should really shorten the initial meditation. I mean, I did go a little bit longer today as usual. I wasn't even intended, but yeah, I'd like to hear your input, because we do spend 15 minutes on the meditation that actually you could do on your own. I'm not sure you would do it on your own. I was first thinking maybe have someone else lead it, but then people maybe won't show up. Or if you ask them to do it before, you won't do it. And I noticed, I mean, some people, we started off with 13 people, and I don't know who it was. And then after the meditation was done, it was 19. So 6 were there a little later anyway. I don't know who is. Like, I don't check all of you. I only see Leora all the time and on the beach. Right now, I only see Leora. Okay. Great. So, yeah. Therefore, let me know about the beginning part. Should we shorten it? Secondly, answer to that question. Please try and answer this question and send it to Dalit, who very kindly always forwards me her all the questions. Jimmy's got some more questions. I really appreciate very good questions. He always asks great questions, so important, conventional I, mere I, what's the difference, and so forth. So he has more questions and I'll address them next time. Great. All right, so let's start to meditate. And of course, we start letting go of any tension and disruptive thoughts. Just focus on the breath for some time. So as usual, let's start our analysis with becoming aware of our sense of I that is with us. The moment we wake up, it's with us the whole day. And even appears during our dreams. To our mind, self appears, seems to exist above and beyond being merely labeled. As if our mind is not satisfied with the I being labeled on mind or body. And since we've all done the meditation of taking the I the way it appears to us, and then investigating, is it one with the aggregates or different? Since it always seems to escape us, check whether you can get a sense that the self could be inexpressible. As one or different from the aggregates. Put yourself into the shoes of the Vatsiputra. And see whether that could make sense to you. The sense that the I is not really one with the aggregates, nor really different, but it's still there. But inexpressible actually means that the I exists in a very vague sense. But shouldn't it be very clearly defined as definitely being either this or that, since it appears so concretely to our mind. And likewise, this I that appears so substantially, inherently real, wouldn't it at least make sense that it's labeled without giving up the sense that it exists inherently, but still to concede that just as a table is merely called a table, or a table is designated on its parts, maybe that's true for the I. That the I is labeled either on something the body does or something that the mind does. So now we haven't really let go of the sense there's an inherent I, but at least we've allowed the possibility that the I is labeled on the basis of the mind or the body. And now all we have to do is let go of the I existing inherently. If the table is labeled on its parts, the I is too. But then there's no need for inherent existence. For whatever exists is either one with itself or different from its parts. Since that's not the case for the inherent I, let's just let go. The sense that there's an I other than the one that is merely labeled. No I to be attached to. No I to worry about. There's no I whose success is important. Whose reputation is important. Whose possessions are important. So now to conclude, see whether you can get a sense of the non-findability of an I that exists separate from being labeled. As existing beyond being labeled. Just focus on that single-pointedly. The absence of an inherent I. And then let's dedicate all the positive potential we've accumulated here together as a group. May this become a cause for us to eventually realize emptiness and use that realization to purify our mind from all obscurations, enhance our love and compassion, and eventually attain the fully enlightened state of a Buddha for the welfare of all sentient beings. May our merit right now, right here and right now, make a difference. Affect those around us in a positive way. Help those who experience unbearable suffering due to sickness, like in the case of Tali Lubin, due to mental problems, loss of a dear one, and so forth. And may it bring them. May the merit we accumulated bring those around us happiness and peace of mind. And of course, as Shantidewa expresses it, may all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries in the world. All right, so thank you very much. And once again, don't forget what to do this coming week. Of course, the disadvantages of self-cherishing, that is still your main focus, and I'm sure you know enough about it to give it some thought, especially when strong self-cherishing rises, to remember at that time. At the same time, of course, bodhicitta should be very much in the center of your life, in the center of your daily life. And as Lama Zopa Rinpoche so beautifully put it in this dedication prayer, well, to also remind ourselves again and again of the lack of inherent existence, especially of our own self, but also of lack of inherent existence of problems, lack of inherent existence of stress, and so forth. So in that way, integrate it, bring it more into our daily life. Okay, that's it. So wish you a wonderful week. Be safe, and I see you again next week. And please let me know, well, your homework, this question I asked you, and about shortening maybe the initial prayers and meditation. Okay, Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Good night,
Geshe.
Geshe.
Okay, good night.
Bye.
Dankeschön.
Bye.
Gute
Danke, good night.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Thank you, Dharma friends.
Thank you.